A guten Erev Yom Tov, a guten Erev Shabbos. Jewish time goes in cycles. We come around again and again to Rosh Hashanah, to Sukkot, to Pesach. Especially at Pesach, when we take out the dishes we haven't seen in a year, and we think about sitting down to the Seder with friends and family we might not have seen in a year, or in this case, 3 years. The familiar and the comfortable comes back to welcome us and embrace us. While most Jews around the world celebrate the Seder in some form or another, tell the story of our birth as a people in some form or another, we know the disappointing reality that some Jews simply don't return to the familiar. They have moved on. They have better things to do with their time, better things than to eat flat bread with bitter herbs, better stories to tell than the story of how we as a people were once slaves and God took us out and made us free. This is said with more than a bit of irony, of course. Unleavened bread and bitter herbs may be the most important meal a Jew eats all year. And perhaps no story is more important, or more impactful, or more meaningful than recounting with praise and thanksgiving how once we were slaves to Pharaoh, and God took us out and made us a free people. Our entire culture is built around telling the next generations, recounting the story, passing it on with word, with text, with food and prayer, in as many ways as we possibly can, so the next generations will value the story enough to keep it alive, to make it part of their lives, and to pass it forward. So it's sad when people opt out. When they opt out of our past, they opt out of our future as well. So that kind of progress and advancement is really not to anyone's benefit, sad to say. Then there is another kind of time, the progress of time, the advance of history. It's supposed to be not cyclical, but linear. It's supposed not to repeat itself, rather to advance in a positive direction, just simply keep getting better and better. I still haven't read a book that I bought 20 years ago called The End of History and the Last Man, which talks about how, with the collapse of communism, Western liberal democracy would finally become not just the ascendant, but really the final, the ultimate and universal form of government for humankind. The sad reality here, too, is that while much of the world is in a measurably better state than it was, let's say 100 years ago, so we can say that globally progress is certainly being made, we have seen in our days a cycle slipping backwards towards authoritarianism and the worst side of nationalism, xenophobia. Maybe inevitably that has brought war in its wake, and we are witnessing before our eyes an awful destruction of a country and a people by its neighbor, which sees it as territory to be conquered, a target for the taking. A tremendous amount of human suffering, misery, and death has occurred in the 2 short months since Russia's attack on Ukraine, and the painful ironies of history are not lacking. To cite just one example of the awfulness of this war, earlier this month, Vanda Obietkova died of starvation and dehydration at the age of 91. Probably too old to withstand evacuation, she was seeking shelter in a basement in Mariupol, where she had lived her whole life, even during the Soviet years when it was known as Zhdanov, after a communist political figure and ideologue. She had never wanted to leave her hometown on the Ukrainian seacoast, where she had been part of the Jewish community all her life, from childhood through communism, through the post-communist era. When war came to Ukraine in recent weeks, and her family once again had to hide from the forces of death, they took to the freezing cold cellar of their house with little food or water. Snipers close by made every bit of sustenance brought to them a potentially deadly delivery. Vanda had evacuated to Zhytomyr with the rest of the community and her family in 2014, the last time hostilities escalated. But the truth is, she was no stranger to hiding in the basement. At the age of 11, in 1941, when the Germans invaded Ukraine, her family went into hiding. Her mother, Mindel, was murdered along with that whole side of their family but Vanda herself managed to keep quiet and hide in a cellar, later in a hospital, until the German retreat 2 years later. She had a chance, decades later, to recount her life story and her experiences during World War II for the record with the Steven Spielberg Shoah Foundation at the University of Southern California, which houses over 54,000 recorded testimonies of Holocaust survivors. So thankfully, her story is not lost to history. But the dignity of reaching one's dying day in peace, surrounded by loved ones, and leaving this world amidst calm and tranquility and peace of mind was not to be Vanda's portion. She died cold and scared, hungry and miserable, hiding, this time from the Russian siege of her city. It's probably never a good idea to ask questions like, how much suffering can one person take? Because as we know too well, the human capacity for suffering seems not only limitless, but expanding, if that's possible. A better question might be, how much suffering can we stand by and see inflicted on others before we make sure the end to such suffering comes? Again, the forward march of history, as so many have hoped and written about, is that conflict will lessen and peace will gradually spread over all the inhabitants of Earth. We will eventually find better ways to settle our differences and coexist on the same planet, rather than falling back to the old violent methods and means. This has been the Jewish view of things, our hope that we bring to the world since our beginnings. The last days of Pesach focus on this. The first days of the holiday speak about our own national deliverance, our liberation from slavery and from the house of bondage, and the last days of Pesach speak about the ultimate deliverance of all humankind, not just the Jews, but everyone, from the shackles of slavery and violence and oppression and misery. Our Torah reading on the seventh day of Pesach is the Song of the Sea, when we acknowledge God as our rescuer and deliverer from what seemed like certain doom. Yet the Shira itself begins, Az Yashir Moshe, Uvenei Yisrael Shira Hazois LaHashem. Then Moses and the Jewish people, children of Israel, will sing this song to God, leading the major commentators to reckon the time when Moses and all the children of Israel will be on hand together to sing this song. When is that? At the Messianic era, at the time of the resurrection of the dead. Its expression in the future tense, then Moses will sing, only strengthens the argument. The last day of Pesach speaks about our ultimate vision for how things will end. Speaking about the Messiah's ability to judge fairly, the prophet Isaiah writes in chapter 11, verse 5, V'hayat tzedek ezor mosnav, justice will be the girdle of his waist, V'ha'emuna ezor chalatzav, faith will gird his loins. From there, it leads to probably the most often quoted passage, V'gor ze'ev im keves, v'namer im gedi yirbots, the wolf will dwell with the lamb in peace, the leopard will rest with the kid. V'egel ukfir umeri yachdav, v'nar katan noheg bam. The calf, the lion, and the fatted sheep will be together, and a little child will lead them. This means literally that those animals which are so dangerous today will not be dangerous in those times, so much so that you can let your kids play with them, explains the Midrash in Torah's Kohanim. Why is that? Because they will cycle back, they will return to their original state as they were created, as they were in Gan Eden, says Rabbi Shimon, mentioned by the Ramban. That if you think back to the original times, there was tranquility and peaceful coexistence in Gan Eden, as there also was in Noah's Ark, right? It means that the predatory and violent nature of the animal kingdom is not a necessary rule. It can be reset. It can restore itself to be as peaceful as it once was. And of course, at the top of the pyramid of the animal kingdom, although you would not always know it by the way we act, is the human being. The lesson here, if we need to underscore it, is that if the predatory and violent tendencies of animals can be nullified in the Messianic era, how much more so those same midos, those same traits, character traits among human beings. Maimonides brings it home right to our doorstep He writes in Hilchos Malachim, the Laws of Kings, at the end of his Mishnah Torah, that the persecutors of the Jewish people will cease to be so. They will rather dwell with us in peace. So in these last days of Yom Tov, when we're looking forward to better days ahead, and looking to bring the past along with us to the time of redemption, we will be saying Yizkor on Shabbos morning and pledging to give tzedakah to make the world a better place in memory of those who preceded us and got us to wherever they got us. We take it over from here, and hopefully, speedily in our days, those who perpetrate violence upon others will soon see clearly the futility and the folly of their ways, and they will pursue peace and cooperation with all the energy and dedication that they now use to pursue the opposite of those things. May we see it obviously and clearly in evidence without needing any further explanation. May it simply be evident to all, and may we all live to fulfill Isaiah's prophecy of peace and tranquility. Chag Sameach and a good Shabbos.